To follow my personal guided prayers in Korean and English, please subscribe to Prayerful Hope. There may be a prayer there that you hope to hear. The link to the channel is in the description box below. Have a blessed day. Hey, how y'all doing? I'm still in China, but every once in a while I do like to follow up on Korean news and Japanese news since I lived in both places. And just recently I was on this Korean news related outlet. I'll just put it like that. It's called Gasengi, and it had this article which was actually a regurgitation of an article that originally came out of Yahoo Japan. And basically it highlighted this poll that was taken that said that they interviewed Japanese and Korean people and asked, what do you think of each other's cultures and food? And in this poll it came out that 70% of Japanese people liked Korean food. And it's hard not to like a lot of Korean food. It is very delicious to almost anybody who eats it. It also said that 40% of Japanese people enjoyed or liked Korean culture. Conversely, of the Koreans that were interviewed, it said that 26% of them liked Japanese culture and 24% liked Japanese food. Let me just make sure. Right, Japanese food. Here's the thing about this poll. 1,000 Korean people were interviewed from a nation of 52 million people. And of the Japanese, there were 1,600 plus out of a nation of 126 million. Those numbers, that random sample is almost infinitesimally small of a representation of these two nations. Now, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that there is some tension between these two countries. But I'm not going to get into any of that in this video, but feel free in the comments section. I'm sure everybody's got their 2 cents about what was done and who's right and who's wrong, but not for this. Having lived in both countries, Korea for about 5.5 years, Japan for a year, I visited Japan 5 or 6 times, major cities, some of the countryside. I can say that Korea has a far, far greater representation of Japanese culture within their nation than it is the opposite, Japan representing Korea within their nation. That's just what my eyes showed me. I'm sure if you're living in Japan you might say differently, but that's just what I'm thinking and seeing. For example, when I first went to Korea, I knew of these tensions, and I was really surprised when I started to notice all of these sushi restaurants and Japanese restaurants in general. There's a lot of food that is extremely popular in Korea that come from Japan. This first is sushi, and the sushi restaurants there, as closely as possible, mimic what you would find in Japan. There's Japanese lettering, you've got the sake, and the sushi is prepared in a similar fashion. You've got this breaded pork that's called tonkatsu in Korea. It's a similar pronunciation to what it is in Japan. Breaded, deep-fried pork cutlets. And there's also izakaya restaurants as well. The other thing, Taekwondo is one of the most widely practiced martial arts in the world. It's an Olympic sport now. In Korea, it's bar none the most widely practiced martial art. But when I was living there, being a martial arts guy, my eyes just kind of pick up on these things, anything martial arts related. One thing I noticed was, second to Taekwondo, I would have to say that Kendo, which is the sword fighting martial art, known as Gumdo in Korea, both mean the same thing. They both mean the way of the sword in their respective languages. Those places are everywhere. Now, I got hurt at one point playing Judo, so I actually took Gumdo for a little bit, and I noticed when I went into a bunch of these studios that they were designed primarily the way that is outlined in the sport of Kendo. The gear, the insignia, things like that. The language used is in the native language for Korea, but other than that, it's very true to the Japanese form. It's even bigger than the sport of Judo. Judo, being an Olympic sport, is an institution in Korea. It's in the public school system. They have university teams. They've got a national training center set in one of the biggest universities up south of Seoul. And Judo and Kendo are both Japanese styles, and Korea embraces them heavily and keeps to the rules and keeps to the essentials of the sport, I guess you would call it. Another thing, when I was in Korea, I worked as a teacher. I still do work as a teacher. Korean students, the young ones, they're absolutely insane about these two Japanese cartoon things coming out of Japan. One is called Doraemon, which is a cartoon. That's how they say it in Korea, Doraemon. And the other one is Yu-Gi-Oh, which is like a monsters card game. And they are berserk about those two things. Those are two of probably the most popular games, cartoons in Korea for young kids. When I was in Japan, I did eat at a Korean barbecue place once with the school that I was with. I'm sure I missed a lot of things, but I just didn't see that representation of Korean culture there that I did of Japanese culture in Korea. I could be wrong. It's just what my eyes told me. And so I don't know if I agree particularly with this article, but keep in mind that the random sample is very small and you don't know who they spoke to. For all we know, they could have spoken to these old Korean men, which you know how they probably would feel toward Japan. And they may have I'm an English teacher. They may have spoken to some young progressive Japanese people who are much more open to the today of Korea and not focus so much on the past or things like that. And they're just saying, hey, I like this about Korea. I like this and I like this. You just don't know. The way I would say it is there's crossover between the two nations. Who likes who more? Who doesn't like who more? You're never really going to know because we're talking about almost 200 million people in this equation. One last thing that I'll leave you with is when I was living in Hiroshima, Japan, I worked out briefly at this BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, MMA dojo. It was kind of small, but I was talking to the owner. Talking to is very limited. He didn't really speak a lot of English. But I was trying to explain to him, hey, I worked out at Busan Team Mad, which is the premier mixed martial arts team in Korea right now. And if you're a UFC fan, you'll probably recognize the name Kim Dong-hyun, who a few years back was the biggest name in the game coming out of Korea. And I said, yeah, Kim Dong-hyun and Team Mad. I worked out jiu-jitsu over there. And he's like, yeah, he didn't recognize. And I said a few more names, and it was drawing a blank until I mentioned the name Ham So-hee, who is a big kickboxer that competes heavily in Japan. And when I mentioned her name and the lights came on when he understood me, he responded, oh, sugoi. Oh, sugoi.